everyone. Thank you. Hopefully you got a little bit of a break and snagged a bite to eat or a drink or whatever you needed to refresh yourself, and join us back here for our closing keynote as part of our main virtual program for the symposium today. We are going to be talking about tools for effective communication is the title. We're going to talk about some of relationships, best practices, and experiences of communicating controversial or high stakes science topics from a person who has a ton of experience in doing this. It's going to be a really awesome conversation. I'm excited for the end of this. It's kind of gone really big picture at the start of today, and now we're handling down really into the practical side of the conversation. I am joined by my dear colleague, Trisha Waddell. Trisha is our managing editor for the Institute for Science and Policy, is going to be moderating today's conversation. Hi, Trisha. Thanks for joining us.
Great to be here. Excited for the talk.
Awesome, me too. And our keynote highlight speaker is Faith Kearns. Faith is a scientist and a science communication practitioner who both writes and talks about all kinds of topics, including water, wildfire, climate change, and people. She's the director of research communications for the Arizona Water Innovation Initiative at Arizona State University's Global Futures Lab. That was a mouthful. I think I got it. She's got a newer book out. She's the author of Getting to the Heart of Science Communication, as well as been published in a ton of other mainstream outlets. We're going to have a presentation here by Faith, and then Trisha's going to come back and ask questions, as well as incorporate those of you who from the audience, if you have questions, so make sure you drop them into the comments as we go along. Alrighty, Trisha will be back here soon. Faith, take it from here. Thank you for being here today.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me and inviting me to be a part of this event. And thanks, Kristen, for the introduction. So you already heard my title. I just want, for a little bit of context, to also say I am a scientist, science communication practitioner. So I focus very much on just the practice side of science communication. I'm not a researcher of science communication. And I've worked in lots of different contexts. I've worked for the government. I've worked primarily for universities, but also in the nonprofit sector and others for the last 25, 30 years, depending on how you want to look at it. So lots of different experiences on different topics in lots of different settings. So, just to start, I want to give a little story that kind of sets the stage for what I'm going to talk about and is very clear about sort of, I guess, my personal investment in this stuff. So I, about 15, almost 20 years ago now, was just out of graduate school, and I was working for a wildfire research and outreach center at UC Berkeley. And we were basically doing what at the time, was fairly cutting edge work. It's obviously much more prominent now, but just doing research and outreach on how people can keep their houses from burning down during wildfires. And we had lots of tools like this one, a little outdated looking, but lots of really great kind of trying to give people the research and the tools to actually use our research, right? And we were, in conversation with everybody we were supposed to be, firefighters, the state legislature, et cetera. And so all of that is to say we were doing what we were supposed to be doing as good sort of community engaged scientists, right? At the time, we were also working on this research paper that came out shortly afterward, which was about this idea of a stay or go policy, which is much more common in Australia, with the idea that people might stay with their homes during wildfires, which we actually see happen all the time, even though it is not a state-sanctioned activity in the United States, right? So this is a really controversial topic, and it can bring up a lot of very sort of life and death feelings for people, right? And so we were up in Northern California at this fire safety demonstration day, me and two of my colleagues. And the idea was we were going to give a couple talks about houses and wildfire and the wildland urban interface, things like that. And that we were also going to, do some demonstration where basically you set components of a house on fire and show people how fire could move into your house, right? But earlier that summer, we were there in the fall, there had been this 2 wildfire outbreak on the central coast of California near Big Sur. And then about a week later, an 18 wildfire complex started in the northern part of the state in Mendocino County, which happened to be where we were. And so both sets of these wildfires threatened homes. People were being evacuated. It was on the news all the time. And in addition, there were another 30 wildfires burning around the state. So this is a story that sounds pretty familiar today, but at the time, we're talking around 2007, 8, it really wasn't. It was more of a sort of a big deal at the time. And people were very, very emotional about what kind of firefighting resources they had in their particular part of the world, right? So here we were in this place where we were sort of talking to people who had just experienced the dilemmas of some of the scientific work that we were talking about, right? And as one of my colleagues presented, I could feel the mood in the room shift completely. And I had no real idea what was going on. But I was really grateful because there was a man who came up to me afterward, and then a woman who basically were telling me, that they had just been through this thing. People had a lot of residual feelings. Some people were mad. Some people were anxious. Some people were grateful that the damage to their houses hadn't been worse. And then there was also this just people really tired. And in words I would use today, but certainly wasn't using at the time, people were definitely traumatized. And our scientific presentation had re-traumatized many people in that room and brought up a lot of feelings they'd had of hopelessness and dilemmas about evacuating and all of that kind of stuff, right? And so it was really sort of listening to this man that day. I feel really grateful that I felt available to him, and he actually was very vulnerable in sharing his feelings about how hard it had been to sort of get his whole house ready for fire, still had some fire damage, wasn't sure if he should have stayed it's gone, etc. So, it's just kind of really being present that day that then set me on an actually completely different career course, where I've been basically looking at science communication in emotional, contentious, sometimes traumatic situations. And as you can imagine, ethics comes up quite a lot in that situation. So just to provide a little bit of context, some of these things will sound familiar because of the talks that came before me, the panels that came before me. There was so much great stuff there. And so hopefully this will both retouch on some of that and tie it together in perhaps a slightly different way. So I always like to start with the definition of science communication that I'm using, because I really do find that a lot of disagreements over science communication come because we all work in such different contexts and therefore need very different tools, right? So what I'm talking about today, I would love to be able to call humanistic science communication someday. We aren't quite there yet, I think, as a field, but the basic idea is I'm talking about communicating science with non-experts, with the very strong caveat that is most of us most of the time, right? People have already brought up today that there can be the sense that people with science training understand all science. I'm trained as an ecologist. The last few years have definitely shown me I'm not an epidemiologist, right? So I think that can give us some compassion for sort of being also the constant recipients of science communication efforts ourselves, right? And my work, particularly my book, Getting to the Heart of Science Communication, really focuses on what I know best, which is not to say it's the only important stuff. I'm really just trying to sort of stay in my lane and talk about what the last 25 or 30 years of science communication have looked like, particularly in the United States, where for most of my career, there really has been this focus, particularly on a training level, on performing, right? Performing scientific authority, giving a good talk, filling what we would call an information gap. You've all already heard again today about the deficit model. With this extra piece that, particularly in the early 2000s, I would say there was this, and it still is the case, it's very pervasive, to basically see that people consider, particularly faculty, I find, consider the epitome of good science communication to be connecting an elite expert at an elite institution with an elite expert of another kind at another elite institution, right? So think that you've got a Ivy League professor who's talking with a reporter at the New York Times or giving congressional testimony, right? And it's left a lot of people feeling like that's the bar. But based on my own background, which has been and spent 20 years or so working in the cooperative extension system of the land-grant university system. I really argue that this sort of more ground level communication, science communication practice has existed at the same time. I know many people who have been doing this work for a very, very long time, but it's taken a backseat to these sort of more top-down approaches. I have lots of ideas about why that's true, but we won't get into them right now. But it has resulted really in a lot of science communication training for scientists, sort of pushing this like sage on the stage model that has really proliferated, right? This idea of a TED Talk. And I certainly recognize the irony that I'm doing that right now. I'm not saying that there's no place for it, but I think sometimes we think of it as the end game, when to me it's really much more of a sort of starting point, right? Because the reality is that science communication is way more complex. And it came up earlier in one of the panels, that I think we know that's true, and yet we still default to these sort of information deficit pieces, right? And I think it's because that's actually hard. And I would actually argue that systemically, we don't quite have the right infrastructure to be able to do what I think needs to be done, which is something probably more akin to the cooperative extension system, although it's not perfect. But the idea is just that, we need to be working with people at more of a person-to-person level. Also, in the course of my career, I will say the people doing the work of science communication has changed vastly, and therefore the practice of science communication is also changing as we go, which I am very, very grateful for. So, for example, Sada Kahanamoku, a dear collaborator of mine at the University of Hawaii now, was writing about the 30-meter telescope. She's native Hawaiian, and said to me, this debate is not about science versus culture. In my practice of science, the two are inextricably linked. I'm Kanaka Aoi, and I do science because I am Hawaiian. I research out of Alohaina, a deep familial love for the land. You also find a lot of science communication practitioners these days, myself included, who are really challenging kind of this reliance on scientific authority. I think because in many ways, a lot of us are not necessarily perceived as being scientific authorities, right? And so you have to find a different way of working. Sarah Myrie, who is a climate environmental scientist in Washington State, told me, for example, the paradigm of science communication has largely been about the appropriate presentation of scientific authority, which has been about divesting from your own mortal and emotional and human connections. You become the problem when you try to do things differently, right? So here she's hearkening to words by the feminist geographer Sarah Ahmed. And so in my book, I interviewed about 100 practitioners. So these are, words from very real people and their experiences of communicating science. This is one of the more profound interviews that I had, was with Mila Marshall, who at the time was a doctoral student at the University of Chicago, but is now graduated and working with the Sierra Club on water issues. And she told me, here she was talking specifically about misinformation and touching a little bit on vaccine hesitancy, and said, when you're talking about these difficult subjects, you have to understand you're asking people to acknowledge there's a chance something they believe to be true, told to them by people they love and respect, is wrong. We can provide accurate information, but there also has to be somebody standing in the gap, prepared to support them through their emotions around how it feels to be corrected and the embarrassment of going hard for what you thought was the truth. So I find this to be a really profound statement, right? Because it really gets at this thing that might be just past the deficit model, which is helping people cope with the information that we're actually providing, right? And so again, what would it look like to actually be able to do this? We're not there yet in a lot of settings. And the other thing that I think, science communication practitioners are really facing is that we are often discussing these very emotional and contentious issues. So the kinds of things I work on, water and drought, particularly California and the desert Southwest, wildfire, and of course there's COVID, right? Which is this thing that has in many ways, I think, made the complexities of science communication legible to a lot more people. It used to be pretty hard to actually explain some of what I'm talking about and the reasoning behind some of the ideas that I've come to here. So just to give a really concrete example of how these ethical considerations can show up, Diamond Holloman, again, just finished a doctoral program at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, works on disasters, particularly hurricanes. in the course of her research, basically was talking about talking with people just after a disaster and sort of saying, you're asking people to recount traumatic events to you and you want to help them, right? And people are okay with you giving their time, but sometimes you just want to do this material thing of helping them with getting a new bed, right? And she says, how do you ask people about their lived experiences after disasters and then ignore the struggles they tell you about? What are the ethical dilemmas of profiting professionally from their stories, right? Again, really big issues that I think we're not we're not in a place to totally address yet, right? Except on an individual level, which can sometimes lead to a lot of burnout. So just touching on some of the tools that I wrote about, which are basically relating, listening, working with conflict, and understanding trauma. And so this is, to me, just sort of a starter kit of thinking about science communication in a very different way. And the basic theory of my book is that we face more of a relationship challenge than we do of a communication challenge. In many ways focused in on this more micro issue of communication at the expense of sort of the macro issue of relationship, right? And when I talk about relationship, I'm trying to talk about it in a very deeply ethical way. And basically the idea is, and there were some comments earlier about issues around sort of behavior change and all of these kinds of things. So I'm actually advocating beyond behavior change into this relational issue where we think about how we relate to each other as equals, right? And there's actually a ton of work on this from different fields. And so we're not starting from scratch here, but this work really does invite very different skills than I think what people are being trained in when it comes to science communication, which is mostly about talking and writing, right? And this is thinking a little bit more about how to even the playing field, how to develop the ability to listen and work with your own emotions and other people's in real time, because when we're listening, we have a lot of feelings, right? And I want to acknowledge that there are deep cultural, spiritual, and scholarship traditions that already talk a lot about relationality, particularly when it comes to Indigenous practice, Indigenous study, but also Black feminist thought, and many, many more areas. And in some ways, it's actually so interesting to see how relationship has been stripped out of science because it's so pervasive and is in many ways just the basis of being human, right? So Melanie Yahtzee, who's now at the University of Minnesota, was talking with me about water is life and saying the word life in particular is about countering the politics and reality of death that resource extraction has brought to Native communities. These relations of extraction basically provide no benefits to Native peoples. And that leads us into this radical politics of relationality based on kinship and simply being a good relative. And as I mentioned, there's also a ton of professional relationship work out there, particularly in the medical field and psychotherapy and lawyer with law. And I talked to a bunch of folks who do that work for the book as well. Lots and lots of interesting overlaps and things that I think could set us up better in the future to do this work better. But Theopia Jackson, who's one of my heroes, a clinical psychologist, when I asked her about how she thinks about working relationally, she basically said, I think of my practice as a service model. I frame my efforts around being in service of others, which means I can't come at it from a place of being an expert with all the answers, right? Which is very, very different than a lot of us were trained in science, right? So this is a really going against a lot of the training we received. And I just want to note that a lot of times we can start to think of relationship in a very colloquial kind of just everyday understanding. But I think it's important to actually kind of try to think about it in a more theoretical, like praxis-based way. Because in a lot of ways, pragmatic example of a relationship-based system, right, is something like a good old boys club, right? And we are not aiming here to sort of replace that system with different members, right? It really is much more crucial to take on the theory that we're looking at kind of who we're in relationship with, who are not, where power is addressed, how accountability is addressed within those relationships. And again, a lot of the work being done in other fields is very clear about this, and we can learn from that. So just to give an example beyond sort of the, listening is another tool I talk about quite in the book. And just to give a clear example of how that can show up in science work, right? Because a lot of times, again, I think we revert to just thinking of what it means to listen as an individual. But what does it mean to listen on a more systemic basis when we're talking about science? So some former colleagues of mine at the University of California Cooperative Extension System, basically during California's last long drought, working with Hmong farmers, there was in the Central Valley of California, there was sort of a mental health crisis spurred on by very low water allocations. And Ruth Dahlquist-Willard basically is an entomologist, but has completely had to adapt the work that she does to work with the people that she works with, and said, we basically went to the community and asked them what they needed, and then also worked with the state to provide that, and then kind of played this middle role where they held some multilingual workshops to talk with Hmong growers in particular about a state grant process that would help them be more water and energy efficient. And people were able to save like 65% on their water and electricity bills. And Michael Yang, who's Hmong himself and also worked with us, basically says how crucial that really was. And I want to stress that this is work that these folks didn't necessarily set out to do in life. And so I think that's the other part when we talk about listening. It's like we also have to think about then how that can actually adjust our own agendas for our work, right? And then, there's also this very strong ethical component to listening. So Jana Lambrinidou, who's an anthropologist at Smith College, is the only person I know who's taught listening to scientists and engineers at a collegiate level, talks about sort of listening where it's often diluted to become about empathy and compassion, when really we're talking about justice and accountability. How scientists listen is inseparable from questions of power, because it can be done in ways that bolster community knowledge, but it can also be done in ways that distort knowledge and compromise scientists' ability to help people in ways that really are experienced by communities as desirable and just. I also talk quite a lot about conflict in the book, because conflict is this really interesting thing. It tends to be you either love it or you hate it. And I'm kind of trying to argue for this middle path of just increasing comfort with conflict. So Mark Thorne, cooperative extension specialist at the University of Hawaii, works with ranchers primarily on the Big Island in Hawaii, and had this really interesting, I was talking about some of the stuff that I'm talking about with you now, and he ended up having this like epiphany, essentially saying that, he had been avoiding talking about climate change with the folks that he works with because he was worried about doing that. But then he sort of realized that if he didn't, people might come back to him in a decade and say, Mark, we trusted you. Why didn't you talk to us about this topic, right? And he says, I now see it as a professional and ethical obligation to talk about what can be difficult topics, and I have to trust the long-term working relationships I have are strong enough to handle it, right? And then finally, I talk about trauma in the book. Tessa Hill, a professor at UC Davis, lives in Sonoma County in Northern California, and is talking here about experiencing the Tubbs fire, saying we woke up in the morning to all these people asking us if we were evacuating. They didn't even know what was happening, started seeing that there was a wildfire in their area, and they had to figure out what to do. Saying by daylight, we noticed some of the ash was as big as our hands and had legible writing on it. Other large pieces were falling into our yard of burnt fabric. The remnants of our community were falling from the sky. That fire erased our sense of safety. It was a community scale trauma. And, we can talk about this a little bit if folks are interested in the question and answer session, but basically trauma is a little bit of a controversial topic these days just because it has so many meanings. Theopia Jackson, again, had talked to me about this a couple of years ago, saying, part of the challenge with the trauma bucket is that it's become a catch-all phrase that means different things to different people. But it's important not to position people who are dealing with significant issues as having something less about them. And Jana Lambrinidou kind of takes this in yet another direction when we're thinking about sort of the ethics of working with people who've been through traumatic situations, right? So she's spent a lot of time working on lead and water issues, particularly in Flint, Michigan, and said, trauma narratives have actually then been weaponized against residents to dismiss their questions about water by suggesting that trauma led to collective distrust of science, right? And this is somewhat of a theme that's been coming up today, not necessarily in the context of trauma, but this distrust, basically saying that this distrust narrative has then rendered people seemingly incapable of recognizing the problem that their water has been fixed, right? So people have become so irrational based on their trauma that they can no longer see the scientific truth, right? But she's saying it makes all the sense in the world, actually, that residents retain a healthy skepticism about the quality of their water just based on their experiences, right? So I'm going to go ahead and stop there. And just leave you with a question that I like to leave people a lot with, is just what more is possible, right? So to me, the field of science communication has been sort of stagnant for the past couple decades in a lot of different ways. But I think we're at a little bit of a tipping point, and I'm excited to see some of the newer practitioners and approaches and things like that. So what more is possible when we imagine science communication and engagement as more ethical and just? And as we sort of move into the Q&A session, I would just say there's lots and lots of places where we could be talking about the ethics of science communication. Certainly labor practices are one of them that almost never rises to the level of discussion, because in some ways it's an internal to the field question, but I think it's a pretty deep one about who gets to communicate science. Again, has come up several times already today. So, I think about things like, what would a code of conduct around ethics look like in science communication, and write about that quite a bit in the book, talking to doctors and lawyers about, say, first do no harm and things, the limitations of ethical codes of conduct, but also just how the lack of one doesn't, it leaves a lot of a void in terms of talking about science communication. So, yeah.
Well, that was awesome.
Happy to talk.
Yeah, no, that was awesome. And there's like so many things that you brought up that I am like excited to ask you about. One of the things that I feel like really strikes me about your work is how much you interrogate and incorporate discussions around accountability and power into science communication. And I would love for you to talk a little bit more about like what that means, particularly when you're talking about really high stakes topics, and how people can think a little more deeply about that.
Sorry, can you reword that? I was trying to jump out of the.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Yes. No, it's not you.
Just talk a little bit more about power and accountability being a significant piece of science communication, how you think about that, how you would suggest people sort of interrogate that for themselves and incorporate that more into their process.
Yeah. So I think, power in particular is something that we, I think in science and just in academia in general have tended to really shy away from, certainly within the sciences and certainly within science communication. And so I think there's two levels I think you're asking about, one of which is like just at the individual practitioner level, how do you think about power, right? And I think that's where some of my attempt to work more relationally has been my solution to that, because a lot of the relational work that arose in, say, psychotherapy came from largely feminist psychotherapists pushing back against this idea that a therapist would sit there and diagnose you, right? And so they were this like expert and you were the person who was needing to be diagnosed. And so people started to be like, well, what does that really mean? How can I diagnose that? Maybe I'm struggling with some of the same problems. And so part of the work of that was to put yourself in a position where you're in the work too. Right. You're not just standing there as some like expert observer who knows all the things and all of that. And so I think if you can start to, as an individual practitioner, really put yourself in that position of sort of being in the mess too. That's a phrase that gets used a lot in this kind of work, that it really helps with that humility piece that people have already been touching on. So that's one component. I think there's also just, having to really comprehend the weight that even just walking into a room and saying, I'm a scientist has, or having a university logo on your presentation has, for both good and bad, right? Lots of people can walk, can see, say, a University of California logo and be like, yay. And I think sometimes people don't realize that there's also a lot of negative reactions based on absolutely real histories of these institutions that can also come with you. And so you have to understand all of that, which is really hard. And then I think we have some, again, deeply institutional issues around accountability, because this relational work takes a lot of work. And, something that came up throughout the interviews that I did with people is we just don't have the time, we don't have the funding, we don't have the infrastructure. And what that leads to is a lot of situations where people drop in, do something for 6 months and then leave. And so there is no accountability, and so I told a couple stories in the book of people deeply struggling with what it means to be accountable in the context of a research program or just science in general. It's actually incredibly difficult. So I don't want to critique anybody for not being able to work in this way. We aren't set up for it either, but I also think we have to start talking about the need for it to get set up, No,
that totally makes sense. There is this idea that, feelings aren't supposed to be a part of science or even like part of being a science communicator. And how do you think about, how can we incorporate our own feelings, also incorporate the feelings of the people that we're talking to in a thoughtful and ethical way when we're doing science communication?
Yeah. So great question. I think it's unethical to not sort of address feelings, because that's part of, again, what I just started to see was there was this elephant in the room almost that, people had really strong feelings. Particularly I work on disaster issues and stuff. So there's a lot going on with people. And I think not recognizing that is unethical. I actually think that. I'll just say it right now. I just formulated that thought. And I also think, just as a human being and as a scientist, that your subjectivity gives you a lot of information. It's like, does your stomach hurt right now? Why? Right? Like, what's going on in a situation that, like, in your body, you feel a certain way? Why would you not use that information to do your work better? Right. But part of that also means discerning when emotion is helpful on your part and when it's not. And then I think there's this really interesting and very underexplored component, which is that mess that I'm talking about, which is like what happens when you have a lot of feelings and the people you're talking with have a lot of feelings. And then there's just, I do a lot of public engagement activities, have my whole career. And, if you're somebody adept at sort of reading the room, you can feel these shifts that happen, and you can either ignore them, which I've seen many people do, or you can start to ease into like starting to address like, I'm feeling a little tension in the room right now. And those are things that I think, depending on where you're at in your career, can come more and less easily. And if you want to start, it's, good to trying to find some low stakes situations in which to do that. Right. Also, it's okay to mess up. It happens. And some of what was coming up in some of the previous sessions too, part of that also means, I think, having to learn outside of the context of scientific training. So most of what I'm talking about right now came to me through learnings of other things that I've been involved in. Like these are not things that were taught to me in my R1 scientific training at all. They came to me through things like contemplative practice, decades-long psychotherapy process, spiritual interrogations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, And so I think that's part of maybe thinking about bringing your whole self to your work too. And I know for a lot of people that's intimidating, but I also know for a lot of people that's very freeing, right? Like we want to be able to do that. And so I'm not arguing that I think everybody, all scientists or science communicators, need to work this way. But I think for people who see the limitations or just want to be able to work in a different way, that there are these really interesting ways to rethink what we think good science communication is.
I think too, what I thought was really helpful in your book is because we don't have to reinvent the wheel, that there are other professions that do this really well and have some models for doing this more relational work, particularly in areas where there's a lot of conflict. I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about that, because I know you mentioned that with medicine, with lawyers, with psychotherapy, that there's some models out there that people can use.
Yeah. And they come with both sort of like caveats and like encouragement. So I think the most developed sort of professional component is in medicine. The first, sort of what they used to call patient-centered and now is usually called relationship-centered medicine. I think the first paper I saw was written in the 60s, but it has taken many decades for that to kind of translate into actual training efforts for medical school students. And so what you do see, and that's why I say it this way, not everybody practices that way, right? Like you can go to a doctor and you can pretty quickly assess who has taken what you might call medical humanities classes, where they talk a lot about deep listening and all of that kind of stuff, narrative medicine. And so there's lots of really interesting pieces there that I think the sciences in general could pick up when it comes to training. Part of that would also be, something that I hope to see, but probably won't in my lifetime, which is a more practicum-based scientific training where you actually do practice as part of the work, right? But we have a very different setup than legal or medical education. And in legal law school, it's the same way. Like you take clinical law, right? And again, not everybody resonates with clinical law, but the people who do find what they need in that kind of course and go on to do that kind of work. So, and a lot of the components that are taught in those are listening, relationship development, working with conflict, basically all the stuff that I'm talking about, right? So, so yeah, I think there's a lot of really good stuff there, with the caveat that, I've heard many times that a lot of medical school students, for example, are very resistant to the medical humanities. Not all of them, but you might get, 10 people in a class related to medical humanities, whereas, there's 300 people in the science, science-based parts of things. And students will literally say, like, I don't care about any of that people related stuff. Like, I just want to learn the science. And I think we would face the exact same stuff. And that's where I think it has to be kind of a choice. But lots of curriculum. I've already been, like Ethiopia Jackson, who's a psychotherapist, does a lot of work with disaster first responders. It's like, why aren't we partnering with these, other schools to kind of let science students in on some of this stuff? And the folks on the other side are interested in being able to have that happen too. So I think that's ripe for innovation for sure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You've also talked a lot about like how, there's a lot to be learned from how these other professions treat listening and listening practices. And you talk a lot about that in your book, that there's a lot of different levels to listening that people maybe like don't necessarily always go deep enough.
Yeah.
And I thought that was really fascinating. And I think particularly your point about, how do we think about ethics as it relates to listening? So I would love for you to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So with the book, I mean, I think there's a chapter on relating, on listening, on conflict, on trauma, and other chapters as well. But that's really the core tool set in the book. And what I was really trying to do is sort of say, we can think of it on this level, which is what I hear most of the time in science communication talks, is like, we need to listen, right? Well, okay, I think not everybody, but I do think most people are getting that message at this point. So what does that mean? And then we sort of default into this individual, like, how do I become a better listener? Great. And there's again, all sorts of tools there, thinking about active listening, thinking about, there's all sorts of different theories of listening. I mean, there's a journal called the Journal of Listening, right? Like, this is a whole thing. And so at an individual level, I think there's lots and lots to be learned, particularly from thinking about meditation practice, contemplative practices of various kinds, and also some conflict work. But then what I was really trying to do was say, how do we sort of more at a systems level think about listening in, say, a science communication effort? And so I tried to show a lot of examples of people actually doing that kind of listening work and the kinds of conflicts that can come up in doing that, right? Because I think particularly in the hands of researchers, listening has been used as an extractive process. And that's why a lot of people, for example, might critique anthropologists, even though they've got these really great tools like ethnography for listening. And so how do you introduce or have the ethical component of that, which is non-extraction, not leaving people in a worse position? I also talked with a lot of journalists for the listening piece. And Lizzie Johnson, who's now at the Washington Post, who had worked a lot on wildfire in California, told me the thing that I think about the most, which is just like, I try to not leave people in a worse position than I found them, because I'm often talking to people on the worst day of their life, right? How do I not make that worse? And so again, it's sort of like a shorthand to first do no harm. It's like, how can I, so now when I think about listening, it's just like, okay, how do I not make this situation worse? Which there's a lot more to it, but I think that's a very easy shorthand. Yeah. But if people are looking for sort of examples of how people have done this in a sort of science communication context, there's some great stories in the book that I would encourage people to read.
I also think that one of the things that you've talked about is just thinking about science communication training kind of moving forward, and the importance of community engagement training being a piece of that. And that sort of like kind of encompasses a lot of the things that you've been talking about. Why do you think that's not more of a part? Do you see some changes happening there? How do you think about how that's been evolving?
Yeah, it's been a really interesting, I mean, in many ways, my book was, and my own work, just life work, has been this attempt to kind of think about community engagement and science communication together. So again, I come from this like cooperative extension system position where that's like that you just do community engagement. That's what you do. And that we had 100-year anniversary of California Cooperative Extension. And I want to say, like, it's not that that system is perfect, but it is pretty decent for what we need right now. And so we had 100-year anniversary of that in 2014 in California. And it just got me thinking, like, there's this 100-year history essentially of community engagement, right? In just this one component of the University of California system. And so why is that never brought up in science communication, where people are sort of constantly saying we need to do X, Y, and Z, and that it is done? Why are we overlooking that? And so I've tried to sort of relate to marry those two things. And so it really has been thinking about, how do we shift from this very sort of, most of my career, one-way communication into this like deeply related thing? Where are the gaps? And so, I think when it comes to, well, and then I'll also say that this is something that is obviously kind of in the zeitgeist, right? Like, it's happening at every university. We're now talking about publicly engaged scholarship and all this stuff. And so, so it's something that, there's a huge turn happening there that's really interesting. And I'm kind of waiting for the backlash, because it will come, right? But what I think that's the most interesting from a training perspective is that a lot of the science communication training, especially over the last decade or two, has been super focused on this just talking piece, like how to message, how to frame, how to, all of this stuff. And it's kind of an arm's lengthening approach, right? It's very sort of intellectually distanced. It's very sort of like, you over there do this or whatever, as opposed to just being like, man, we're all in this big mess together. Like, what do I know that can help us? And what do you know that can help us? And how do we sort of forge our way forward through that? And I think the best way for people to get trained in that is through practice. It's not much of a classroom learning thing. And so, that's what I'm really thinking about when it comes to training, is how do people who might be in a scientific training program also get access to community engagement work in a deep way, not just sort of a project level thing, but, a deep experience over maybe a year.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Along with that, obviously, DEI stuff is also a big piece in the zeitgeist, and also a big piece of training everywhere in every workplace. And so, I mean, switching gears to talk a little bit about that, whether that's coming from the practitioner side or being very aware of that with the communities that you're engaging with. Maybe talk a little bit about how you see those. I mean, there's obvious impact on science communication, but what are some of the nuances that you feel like people may not be readily thinking about how those practices really influence what's happening?
Yeah. So, again, multiple levels. There's a chapter in the book that's focused on equity, inclusion, and justice. At the time, that was sort of as far as I thought I could go. I think if I were writing it today, I would push a little bit more into sort of liberatory practice and thinking about it in that way. But I basically share a lot of stories of sort of diverse science practitioners and the communities they work with and the issues that they're facing. So at a base level, what I think is that training has always been set up in this way that's like, here's this set of tools and it will just work magically for everybody. And so my first real confrontation with that was just being like, yeah, I don't think anybody's ever going to see me as the scientific authority that they see, this person in, right? So like, how am I going to do this work? Because I can't rely on that. I can't walk into a room looking like a scientist. And so, and that's me as a white woman, right? So it's like, and speaking English and all of that kind of stuff as a first language. So I think it can get harder and harder, right? But I think people are also seeing that like, there's this unmet need within diverse communities to also have diverse science communicators talking with them, understanding issues in a totally different way. So that's just a like very base level thing, is like that the way we think of what good science communication practice is actually has to change, because it doesn't work for everybody, right? And it doesn't work for the communities that we work with. So that's one piece. And I'll give one like just really interesting example that I've been thinking about so much, which is like, I ended up doing some science communication training for primarily, immigrant Spanish speaking community in the Salton Sea area of California, where this community is facing a lot of environmental justice issues and constantly being asked to talk about their trauma related to that, right? And they themselves just sort of saw like, we don't want to do that. Like, we don't want to just talk about our trauma, right? So we want to feel like we can walk into a room and be seen as both technical experts who also have this lived experience, but we aren't just our lived experience. So even thinking about that, like, how do you actually train residents, right, to be science communicators, is super interesting twist. And to me, I think probably where things are headed a little bit more is just, if we really are gonna stop this sort of like experts only position, like how do we actually work with people to kind of advocate for their selves, using the information that maybe scientists are creating.
Yeah. So I feel like, there's been so many great panels and so many things that we've talked about today, and there's like a lot, like if I'm a science communicator myself, I guess we're asking a lot of people. It can probably seem a little overwhelming. Obviously it's important to think about like how we take care of ourselves as science communicators and self-care, and talk a little bit about how you do that for yourself, because these are very intense topics to be engaging with people in this very deep and meaningful way on a regular basis.
Yeah, to be real honest, it depends on the day. I just like everybody else have just days where I'm like, I don't want to do this anymore. Part of it is like, I started my training at a time where I did not think I was going to be talking about climate change for, 2 or 3 decades and the rest of my life, right? Like, that wasn't really where I started. And so it's, there are days when it's really challenging. And so I think those days, it's like you need these touchstones of just why you're doing what you're doing, and knowing that you can step away for a little while. And that's been one of the hardest things, is just going like, yeah, I need a break, and I'm actually going to let myself take one. I just turned 50, and I would say only in the last maybe 2 years have I been able to allow myself to do that. But I've actually been much more inspired by some of the folks I talked to for the book about kind of self-care and community care. So Lydia Jennings, for example, now a postdoc at Duke, is an Indigenous woman from New Mexico who basically does a lot of trail running and also studies mining remediation. And she just has this whole very grounded approach to kind of how she takes care of herself, which is through running. But also, like, her running work relates to her science. Her running relates to her science and to her sort of community engagement, where she's trying to bolster Indigenous youth to be runners and scientists. And so just like, that holistic picture where she constantly is able to keep in mind why she's doing what she's doing, sort of has the running as a release. Like, it's, and there's several people I talked to who have those practices, and really inspiring. And I would actually turn to them more than my own self, for sure.
Well, kind of to like on the other side of that, an interesting question from the audience of just how do you then balance like we have some really significant issues happening that require some sense of urgency to try to help people through. How do you balance sort of the need to like get on board with all the things that we're trying to all incorporate into our science communication practice with sort of like the sense of urgency with what we're dealing with?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give a vulnerable and deep answer there, which is that I think, sort of my own trauma history has made me good in disasters and good in crisis, right? And that's something that I've had to really realize is that my own history sort of draws me to very dramatic situations. And over the last probably 5 years, I've had to learn that like I probably need to step away from that a little bit because it triggers my sense of like needing to save everybody or take care of everything, which is not for me, it's a maladaptation, right? Like I clearly can't save everybody and I clearly can't take care. And just that mindset is not helpful, right? So I think just kind of having to balance this sense of urgency with the fact that like there are lots of us, right? And I had a friend who is a therapist who works on climate change issues kind of say to me like, I don't love the military analogy, but she was just basically like, frontline soldiers have to retire and they have to retire young. So what is the next iteration of that, right? And so I think we have to be thinking about it on a systemic again versus individual level of like, how do we create a whole team where people can step in for each other, work in solidarity without having to take on the world by themselves. And I think a lot of that is, there's a lot of good principles from organizing work that we can learn. Again, like I just think all of this is out there and the sciences have sort of had this like, boxing themselves like we aren't humans and we don't have to deal with all this stuff, but we absolutely do, right? So how can we learn from others?
Yeah. Well, I think that's an awesome place to end the conversation.
Thank you, Tricia. Thanks for the great questions.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I would highly recommend this book. Really good. Really good. So that's my.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you both. What a great conversation. Faith, appreciate your vulnerability, your ideas, and for being here today. Tricia, awesome. You're such a great colleague. Love having you facilitate that.